Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the news that Keir Starmer is under increasing pressure to bash Boris Johnson over the head with his Brexit failures after over 6 long weeks of utter carnage to our business and job prospects. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So for anyone who's heard me talk on the issue of Labour and Brexit over the past year, you'll know that I've begrudgingly supported the silence on the issue last year. To have banged on about Brexit in 2020 wouldn't have made a material difference to anything and would have just played into Boris Johnson's hands. He was desperate to talk about Brexit and desperate to avoid talking about COVID. Starmer had more than enough to attack the Conservatives with in their rampant healthcare failures. But 2021 is different. Yes, the Conservatives are still messing up our COVID response, but it's harder to persuade voters, particularly swing voters, of this because the news seems so good right now. It's all very optimistic, but you know what isn't good news? That's Brexit. It doesn't matter how you spin it. And I'm not going to say I don't understand why Starmer has been silent on Brexit until now. I do understand. I just completely disagree. And before people say yet again that Starmer has hamstrung himself with his decision to vote for the deal, this is not the case. He supported the Conservatives on a range of pandemic measures last year and yet still held Johnson to account for his failures on the issue. In fact, there was at least one occasion last year when Boris Johnson only got his pandemic measures through Parliament with Labour votes. If Labour had have joined with the Tory rebels, they would have sunk them. And yet Starmer, even though his support had actually got them through, was still there a day later bashing the government for not going far enough and for not getting the results even when his party supported them. There is no reason at all to say that this, to not say rather this deal is better than no deal, but also to be able to say, but it's not a good enough deal. In addition, the Liberal Democrats have recently announced an official policy to rejoining the customs union and single market. It should not be difficult at all for Labour to do the same, and they should have done so earlier. Don't get me wrong, I do understand the fear of turning Lexiteers away, but to that I would say a few things. One, a lot of those Lexiteers follow the anti-Starmer mob anyway, not necessarily all, but a great many of them. These people will either vote Labour in the next election or they won't, but it won't be based on any particular policies, just how effective the likes of Momentum and their children are in turning these people away from Labour. You don't win or lose votes with any sort of Brexit stance amongst these people, although ironically I will say that the Momentum leadership, whilst Corbyn was leader, were never pushing the Lexiteer agenda anyway, to be fair. The second thing to say is there are a lot of people who would support Labour to deliver electoral reform if it's tied to a closer relationship with the EU. I don't want to throw out silly statements without firm polling evidence because although people will show you polls say, well, look, there's a clear majority who regret leaving the EU, therefore there's a lot of votes in it for a party that becomes pro-EU. That's not true because you can also see polls. Yes, they show a clear majority of people regretting leaving the EU, but when you then ask the question, so do you think we should rejoin? It's actually evenly split. Disappointing for me, evenly split. Now, you can argue part of the reason for that is no one is still years later making the argument for being in the EU in this country. But there it is. That is the polling evidence. And also, people don't necessarily use their vote in a general election on any particular issue. You may feel very strongly on an issue, but it may not influence your voting decision. But it's likely that there are to be more people to be won over in 2024 on a traditionally Labour pro-European platform than turning them away by not doing so. And if we've learned anything over the past few years, you don't win elections by adopting a Tory-light stance on any issue. The third thing to note is that Brexit is going to continue to get worse. That's all there is to it. Even if the Conservatives try to fix the problems, which at the moment they're not doing, they're talking about trying to fix them, but when you look at what they actually want to do to fix it, that's not going to fix it. At some point, it's quite likely they will genuinely try to fix some of the problems, and they will make a mess of it. We know that. We know they're incompetent. They've set themselves up in opposition to the administrations of both the EU and the US as well. They're effectively diplomatically isolated. International diplomacy is not going to be Johnson's strong suit. You know, the party has got to come up with solutions to the problems that they have caused. And the thing is, Starmer doesn't even have to present himself as anti-Brexit as such. It would be nice, but he doesn't have to. He can just present himself as anti-Tory Brexit. Make it clear that there were other forms of Brexit, and there still are other forms of Brexit, other paths we could take. Being in a customs union with the EU was always Labour policy, even under the eurosceptic Corbyn. Why would someone who's much more comfortable being a europhile Labour leader not adopt the same clear policy? And don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that Starmer should adopt policies just because he's comfortable with them. You know, I said that when he became leader, he needs to ignore the people who have this childish attitude towards Labour leadership that, oh, you know, the leader has these policies and therefore those will be the policies of the party. The policies of the party should be the policies that will get them elected. And that's all there is to it. I will support any path that leads to a Labour government. Doesn't matter what that stance is on Brexit or not. If a particular anti-Brexit stance would make electoral success less likely, then I would say don't take it and let pro-EU campaigners do the heavy lifting there. But people are losing their businesses and losing their jobs, and that is going to continue at pace. I see no danger at all in telling people that the reason for this is not because we left the EU as such, because if you remember, we left the EU at the end of January 2020 and we didn't suffer these problems when that happened. It's because we left the customs union and lost access to the single market. I would point out that we still struck our own trade deals, like with Japan, for example, which the government want to claim is a really good trade deal, whilst we were in the customs union and single market. We still adopted our own vaccination policy whilst we were in the customs union and single market. So now, some influential Labour members are calling on Starmer to break his silence, basically. Now, it has to be said, this is Starmer's silence particularly. Labour, frontbench Labour MPs have been attacking Brexit. So it's not that Starmer has said that Labour mustn't oppose it. Labour are. He's certainly allowing his front bench. In fact, they'll all coordinate amongst each other. It's just that he isn't bringing it up at PMQs. He's not driving it himself. And I think he really needs to. Because the bottom line is that although Starmer is still making Johnson look bad in PMQs over the coronavirus response, it just isn't holding sway with the public to the same extent. The public think that we're coming towards the end. Yes, there's going to come a time when they realise we're not at all. But Labour have lost their lead that you know, over the course of this year again, that they narrowed it last year and they've lost it again this year. Starmer knows he has to do something to reverse that, and he does know that. I'm not just assuming that. That's been stated. 2020 was the year to close the gap. They did that. That was fine. When he goes to the polls, the anti-Starmer crowd are muted. You know, when he goes up, they're silent. When it comes down, they chip up again. You know, 2021 needs to be the year when they get ahead and silence the doubters for good. This has not been going well so far. And part of the problem is that Labour have not told the public what alternative they offer with a Labour government. How is it going to be better than a Conservative government? It's all right saying that the Conservatives are useless. A lot of people agree with that. Unfortunately, Boris Johnson is convincing them that as bad as it is, no one else would have done any better. So that's what Labour need to work on now, convincing them actually there is a better way. And Labour have started setting out some firm policies. This is certainly happening now and will be ramped up over the coming year. They're also planning to get members of the front bench out and about as soon as pandemic restrictions are lifted in order to raise their public profiles. Again, absolutely vital. At the moment, these people are largely unknown amongst the voting public. Most people do not know who they are. But although coronavirus will still be with us in 2024, it won't be like it is now. It's very difficult to judge to what extent it will be a political hot potato for the Conservatives. But Brexit will still be a defining political argument then. In fact, more so, because we'll be getting ready for the review of the deal. Brexit inevitably has to be discussed at the next general election, because whoever forms the government after it will then conduct the review to decide whether we carry on with the deal in its current form or whether we change it for something else. And with the Liberal Democrats already defining their Brexit approach, I really can't see how Labour can afford to be left behind. When progressive parties split their votes, the Conservatives win. And the Liberal Democrats are not going to sweep to power. That's an absolute non-starter. And I know some are talking about, well, there needs to be a progressive alliance then between these parties. Now, if such a thing happened, it may or may not, I strongly suspect not, it couldn't possibly be agreed upon until 2024. There's no point in even pushing that now. They will never agree to it years ahead. Nobody would commit to such a thing early on, because what is then there to fight for? And I won't hold my breath on it happening at all. It may do if the situation is desperate, I suppose. But Labour needs to be the rallying call for every single voter who wants rid of the Conservatives. They are the only party that can form a government other than the Conservatives. That's all there is to it. Whether they do it on their own, whether they do it, you know, with a supply and confidence alliance, or whether they do it with a coalition, they are the only ones who can form a government. And obviously, you know, making any gains in Scotland is going to be difficult, which means that Starmer can take no chances anywhere else. Yes, the policies on electoral reform and reversing privatisation of public services can form a solid platform, but you have to stand against everything the Conservatives are doing wrong right now. And a big part of that is Brexit. But let's be clear, this isn't a case of Labour screaming at Starmer to stand against Brexit consequences. If that were the case, he'd be clearly more than happy to do so. You know, you can read some articles and you get the impression that Starmer's just going against all his MPs and other senior members of the party. The fact is the party is incredibly split on the issue, much more so than the general public. You know, we know that amongst the voting public, Labour doesn't get that much support from those in favour of Brexit, even in the Red Wall. But at the same time, within the party, and you can't ignore the party, there's a much higher proportion. It's a bit like the vote on the deal in December. You know, some looked at it and there were about 30 MPs who abstained, and they said, well, Starmer should have abstained. There were calls for him to abstain, and if he'd have abstained, then there wouldn't have been that size of rebellion then. But if he abstained, for a start, over half of those MPs who would have just voted differently. They'd have either voted for it or against it. There are about 20 Labour MPs who just defy the Starmer whip on any contentious issue, specifically to undermine him. That's all they're doing it for. Sometimes they'll contradict their own stance on something just to undermine him. And other Labour MPs would have rebelled by voting for it. It's known there were a lot of Labour MPs who wanted to vote for it as well. So arguably, the decision to vote for it wasn't because Starmer believed it was important to vote for it strategically, but actually he was potentially doing that, I don't know, to reduce the size of the rebellion on that vote. I said at the time, Labour could have voted for it and they could have abstained. They could have justified either decision and it wouldn't have made a difference strategically. But Starmer also said that he'd call Johnson to account on the consequences of the deal, even though he was supporting it. He says, I'm supporting it as better than nothing, but I am going to hold you to account on the consequences. Okay, good. That's what I'm waiting for now. And I reject the argument that he can't attack Brexit because he supported the deal for reasons I've just gone over. However, there is an argument that the longer it takes him to make a stand, the more it will just look like political opportunism when he finally has to do so. And Johnson will certainly call it out as such. And this fear that Starmer may have, if this is what it is, about losing the Red Wall support by attacking Brexit, has to be cured, and quickly. Those people in the Red Wall will not give a crap about philosophical arguments about sovereignty when their job prospects are looking much worse due to no trade. People in the north of England may be susceptible to contracts, as susceptible as anyone else, but we're also practical. We know we can't eat sovereignty. They were told that Brexit will bring them jobs. Starmer used to be fine telling them that this was all lies. Well, he needs to remind them again. But those are my views. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.